All right, guys, let's see. Today, let's talk about what we think of in Chinese medicine as sort of a mini cycle of childhood development. Now, you guys remember in two episodes in the past, we talked about, remember, the pregnancy cycle as it proceeds along the five elements. So 2 months, 2 lunar months per element. So it's kind of this elegant thing. And then we had the whole life cycle, both of those starting with wood, and the whole life cycle is how your life progresses according to these five elements, right? So if you haven't heard it, go back, you can listen to it. Your life according to five elements or whatever. But in this one, there is a third cycle. In fact, in this sort of schema, there's actually three cycles that everybody goes through in life, and this is one of the cycles. So, whereas the first two cycles are considered yin cycles, meaning they are about the growth of a structure. So, during the pregnancy, the baby is growing. During your life, your physical body is growing. Those are considered yin cycles, and they start with wood, as do the yin organs, meaning that it's a yin cycle, but it starts with yang and finishes with yin. So it starts with yang, wood and fire, and then ends with ultimate yin, so water. And whereas this mini cycle for childhood development actually begins with metal, as do the yang channels, remember? And so this sort of is considered, it starts with relative yin and ends with relative yang. But it's a way to explain how children develop in the first cycle. So you remember when we were talking about the whole life cycle, it starts with wood, right? Wood is spring, this is, adolescence, this is childhood, all that. It proceeds along two cycles of 7 and 8. Right. So for girls, the wood cycle goes for 2 cycles of 7, and for boys, 2 cycles of 8. Well, this little mini cycle falls within the first part, the first 7 or 8 years of that wood cycle. So of your whole life cycle starts with wood. This little mini cycle is like a cycle within a cycle. Okay. So this occurs for girls, they will go through the five elements within 7 years, and boys will go through the five elements within 8 years, starting with metal. Okay. Hopefully that's all making sense. It's a cycle within a cycle. So there's sort of two going on at the same time here. Okay. This begins with metal. This is kind of the neonate phase. So they come out of the womb in this sort of, in the metal phase, really metal, they say, this is what is said about it, is that they actually absorb lung qi from their caregivers through touch. So this is the importance of sort of skin to skin touch and all that. And it sort of represents air, care, there's this little rhyme. And it really is, in a sense, if you think about what constitutes the metal element, it is sort of we sort of say in an expanded way, the sort of sense of self. So how you relate to yourself, right? And so sort of extrapolating from that sort of notion that the metal refers to the corporeal soul, refers to the physical body. Actually, I had a teacher say to me once, he said, you want to see the corporeal soul, the po, you look at somebody who's in a coma. All of those autonomic nervous system functions that are still operating in that situation, those are representative of the corporeal soul but in the case of a coma, there's no hun there. So the aspect of the shen that we relate to the liver is not present. All you can see is their po in that situation. And in a sense, babies sort of show this quality as well, meaning that they don't have awareness of the outside world to some degree. Right. So it's almost kind of like in a funny way, the way that it was described to me was it's sort of like a one-dimensional sort of existence where they just sort of live inside themselves. And then out of nowhere, suddenly food enters their space towards their mouth, and they have this rooting reflex, right, to find it. And as soon as it touches, but they're not necessarily cognizant in any conscious way of the world outside of them. Now, of course, they're having an experience of connection. All of these things are super, super important, that these babies get connection, but it's not a conscious awareness of the world outside of them. It's a more sort of sub unconscious, however you want to phrase this. It's in a sense, the way that it was pressed on me was this is a one-dimensional existence. They sort of live inside themselves, and they're not particularly, in that sense, conscious of the outside world. Okay. And don't you see this in a funny way with metal type adults? They can be a bit selfish, in a way. They're sort of so in tune with themselves that in a sense the world revolves around themselves. They can yeah. It's a thing. So this is said to be the metal phase, the neonate phase. Okay. And as they get a little older, it's they sort of, everything's about them sort of getting what they need. They sort of like everybody, in an evolutionary thing. They say, oh, they have this smile reflex and it makes people want to be around them. I mean, who knows? But they're starting to gain some consciousness of the world outside them, but not in a way that's sort of differentiated where they're discerning things from other things. Like you could, in the metal phase, they can sort of just get passed around to anyone and anyone can hold them and the kids are happy. Because in a sense, they don't necessarily in a conscious way differentiate the world outside of them. But this does begin to shift around the water phase, where they start to develop a fear of strangers. They may even start to develop in this is where you kind of would first start to see sort of even nightmares or night terrors. And for a lot of kids, just depending, can be 4 months, 6 months, in that range. This is still infancy. But now there's a clear consciousness of to some degree of who's around them. They start to have preferences for who can hold them. So a little bit of that fear creeps in, and a little bit of this. In a sense, they say that metal is sort of one-dimensional, whereas water element becomes sort of two-dimensional. Sort of yin and yang sort of enter the picture here. And so the ability to differentiate or discern, this is sort of an important portion of this. A certain kind of mental energy prevails here. There's a certain kind of strength that fills into the mind, so to speak. And this goes on from, like I said, about 4 to 6 months up to maybe about a year and a half, where they actually begin to make a transition towards the wood stage. Okay, and then the wood stage around 1.5 is where we actually kind of say the kids sort of enter the terrible twos. So it's not just that they differentiate the difference between themselves and other versus other, but now the wood stage, that hun energy is starting to kind of kick in here. It's starting to fill in. And so they're beginning to learn how to interact with the world, realizing that they, in a sense, can affect the world around them through interaction, that their behavior can create consequences, in a sense. Like, their behavior has an effect on the world. And this really is the beginning of the wood stage. This is really the beginning of socialization, really learning to relate to others. Now, of course, we sort of say, the hun energy is about the general, right? So the hun energy has this understanding of sort of spatial awareness, temporal awareness, so space and time, right? And then a really important factor here that kids start to show is, in a sense, planning. And understanding, at least in some very small way, an understanding of time, of some kind of cause and effect, right? So that they can ask for something and then get it in the future, so to speak. Now, of course, this is a pretty small space in which they operate, of course, but this ability to begin to, in a sense, manipulate their surroundings, and I don't mean that in any negative way, just in a neutral way, this is where you start to get, parents sort of talking about the terrible twos, right? Which really can begin at 1.5, depending on different kids. But we say the terrible twos, because then they, it's an element of control as well. They want to control everything related to themselves to some degree. And now, of course, this depends on sort of the constitution of the kid. we're all born into our constitution, and this is where this really can start to show sometimes, so a kid who's born earthy, their relationship to the wood phase is going to be different than a kid who's born pretty woody. So a pretty livery kind of type kid. Now they really come into their own in this situation. The control things and all the little things, and they realize they can say no, and they and my teacher would always say this thing: they're sort of fighting against the realization that the world doesn't entirely revolve around them. And this is not untrue in a way. So this now really begins where the real parenting in terms of socialization begins. And so there's a million things that could be said here, and this doesn't really fit for what we're talking about here. I just want to give a very general outline of how this sort of works. So this real socialization begins, about 1.5, and really extends. This one goes on for a while. It really extends through until the end of age 4. So this could be 3 years, 3.5 years possibly. And, not every kid hits it at every time. Like some kids are fine through the 2s, and then they hit 3s, and suddenly it's the 3-nagers. And I had a parent say, "Oh, forget about all that. It's the effing 4s, forgive me." But, different kids can hit their stride at different times during this period. And really what it is they're just trying to figure out how the world works. They're working on boundaries. They're flexing against the boundaries. They're just trying to learn. They're testing boundaries, especially as they get a little older. You really start to see them kind of testing those boundaries a bit. But really, this is just a learning process. It's a socialization process. And, my teacher would always pause here and say, we often have this funny idea that children are sort of born little Buddhas, and it's just the parents' job to kind of ruin them. But this is really not the case at all. This is what he would say, right? This is not the case at all. This is children need to be socialized. Children need to be taught how to operate in the world. And there's a million ideas on how this best to be done, and I'm not going to wade into this argument, but this is the time that's so important, right? And this goes on for a long time. And so then what begins to happen is there is a transition from this woodiness then to fire. And the difference here is sort of the difference, for those of you who have had kids move through these ages, it's really the difference between a TK or a preschool kid and a kid who's truly ready for elementary school. There's just a difference in kind of how their mind sort of works, and the level of consciousness sort of bumps up suddenly. I've gone through this with a couple of kids now, and and I see it in my clinic all the time, is like somewhere right around 5, depending on the kid. It could be late 4s, it could be late 5, just depends. A little later for boys, and just something about their level of awareness, their sort of rationality, so to speak, comes online. And they do a transition from where in the wood phase, when in kind of in that toddler phase, in the wood phase, they do something called parallel play. In psychology, they call it parallel play because they like to be around other kids. They sort of seek to be around other kids, but they don't necessarily engage with other kids in the same way that you would when you're older. They sort of like to sit next to each other and do their own thing. They like to be near the kid, but they sort of do their own thing and watch the other kid, and it just depends on the kid. But this is generally what they call parallel play, where when you hit the fire phase, where the Shen is really coming online, maybe what we call the small Shen as it relates just to the sort of constricted to the fire element, they start to use their imagination. They start to connect with each other in a way that you've never seen before, where they're not just playing next to each other, they really turn towards each other and play with each other. They connect in a way that's more complex. they sort of really make a friend in a way. This is it's not. I often think when I see these little fire kids, it's like this is like sort of the first taste of adulthood in a funny way that you really get with your kid. Um, just a clearer sense of what the path is for them a bit. Because they're really more connecting on a genuine level. You can sort of talk to them with more rationality, if you know what I mean, to some degree. But there is a transition that definitely occurs here around, late 4, about 5. And this is where they can start kindergarten. They get more inquisitive, more questions, and they start, they just everything changes about how they work. They're a little more bright-eyed and bushy-tailed in the way that they're like kind of game to get out into the world a bit more. There's a bit of independence that occurs here, and of course we honor that independence by sending them out to school a lot of the times. So this fire phase, then, it's really the time when, even though we say the wood phase is about socialization, I think a lot of it is the socialization between the parent and the child. Okay, but here in the fire phase, you get more, it's the socialization between kid and kid. They're really now directly connecting and can play together in shared fantasies for long periods of time, which you just don't see in the wood phase. Okay, so this kind of connection is what occurs. This is where, like I said, this is where kids are starting to enter school, right? So this fire phase goes on for about 2 years, and then right around age 7 or 8, of course, a little earlier for girls, a little later for boys, they enter what we call the earth phase. And this now, because it's the earth phase, this is the beginning of the intellect, right? So this is the beginning of the yi. And the difference here is that, a good example of this is you do see a fairly big shift in the schooling sort of academics. They really, it's like this is where a kid can really start to be active more academically. You can teach them to spell and to read and expect them to remember facts and math and these kinds of things. They can sort of rationalize their way through a problem in a more direct way, in a more academic way that you don't really see in the fire phase. Okay, so they can do some education during the fire phase. This is sort of kindergarten, first grade. But we tend to downplay what we expect from them in that phase. But once they hit second, third grade, it's full steam ahead. Now we're in school. We're learning things in steps, and they're expected to understand. So this is really the time that actual learning can begin. Okay. Now, this is the basics of it. I kept it very general. I moved very quick through this. What we say here, though, what's also interesting about this is that what can happen is that major disruptions or major problems that occur during any of the stages can actually cause the child to get stuck in a stage. Okay, so the most obvious example would be the wood phase, right? So if a child is acting out during the wood phase, a little bit of a woody kid, and they're in the wood phase and they're woody already, and then they're doing a little bit of the tantrums and the so-called terrible twos and all that kind of stuff, and the parents are a little bit overbearing and kind of having a hard time with the kid, the parents might come down a little bit on the kid, over disciplining, a little bit of harsh discipline, a little bit too much discipline, really pushing the kid to quote unquote behave during that phase at a time when they're not rational. In a sense, they haven't hit that fire phase yet where they can be sort of rationalized with, you can sort of talk to them a bit. It's like toddlers, parents fall into the trap of thinking they can sort of rationalize with their kids, but really can't. But it's such a thing to do because the kid is really, kind of driving you nuts maybe or something. So this over discipline at this time can actually cause the child to get stuck in the wood phase. So then what we would say, or what Chinese medicine would say about this, is then as an adult, that sort of trauma that sort of occurs, we'll call it a trauma, that trauma that occurs at that time causes them to get stuck. So now as an adult, they're woody. And we can pathologize this all day via some kind of psychological definition. Of course, we could psychoanalyze this all day. That's not what I intend to do here. It's to say that the over discipline during the wood phase represents a trauma, and the child gets stuck in the wood phase, and now they're all woody as adults. They got stuck there. Then you could be, you go back a little bit, like metal stage stuff. Metal stage is like survival. The child is just surviving. That's all they're doing. It's pure reflex and survival. That's all they got going on. Water phase, sort of fear enters into the thing. So you kind of think about people or think about yourself. We would say in Chinese medicine that trauma that occurs during those phases could cause people to get stuck in those phases. So what kind of things? Some kind of, maybe the parents split up during the water phase or the metal phase. Maybe the mother during the metal phase, when the child and the mother are so deeply connected, the mother is suddenly not in the picture for whatever reason. The child loses that connection all of a sudden. Or maybe the mother is there but is going through a major trauma at that time for herself, and the child is experiencing that through the mom to some degree. Some major change, something that to our minds might represent some kind of trauma. Well, the child could get stuck in that. So you think about yourself, you think about the people you know. I mean, how many people do you know who really just show so much fear in every decision-making process? There's so much fear that underlies so much of their thinking. And you go even one step back, which in a way is worse. Some people are just stuck in survival mode. So even when things are seemingly okay in their surrounding area, and yet there's something about the way they operate where they are just in survival mode. I mean, they don't even see the world outside themselves. I mean, you could think about addiction in this case, but let's pick something less serious, just a more subtle underlying thought process. Fire stage, earth phase, these things can happen. You think about the fire phase, you look at how schools have gone in terms of academics. There's such much more pressure on teachers to push children even in the kindergarten time. Even in kindergarten, teachers are being pushed on academics for the children. I remember the first parent-teacher conference I went for one of my 5-year-olds, and it was years ago. And the teacher pulled out all these papers with all of these little metrics and stuff. And I was looking at this stuff. I was like, "Oh, okay, cool." And then I was just kind of looked at her. I was like, "Well, how is she? Is she happy? Is she getting along with the kids?" And she just kind of looked at me, funny, and she goes, "Oh." And she just kind of leaned back and relaxed. She's like, "Oh, you got a great kid, man. She's great. She's a sweet kid. She gets along with everybody. She's just a joy to be around. She's, really fun and all this stuff." She's like, "Whatever you've been doing, just keep doing that." And she was like, you could see, like, she was visibly relieved not to be talking about schooling. And so then we had a chat, and she was like, "Oh, man, I get parents coming in here, just the one before you parent was here, just grilling me on the academics. Well, how's my kid doing in this and that and this and that?" And so we could say, in a sense, that during the fire phase, this is really where all of that fire energy is coming out. Remember, we talked about the fire energy when you're sort of in your young adult phase. Well, to some degree, this is kind of sort of true with kids. They're kind of breaking out a little bit, and the fire phase is all about relationships. It's them really creating their first real relationships, in the sense of like starting and maintaining it. And, not just by happenstance because your parents took you to the park and there's another toddler running around, and, and then you don't see them and you don't really think about it. But for a 5-year-old, there's a deeper temporal thing. You're initiating, creating, and maintaining a relationship at that time. And instead, you're surrounded by a situation when at the one time during the day where you could be making relationships at school, instead you're working on worksheets. You had all day at school to hang out and make friends and, initiate relationships and learn how to, maintain relationships in a healthy way. And instead you were, nose down in a worksheet learning stuff. Chinese medicine would actually say that this is the improper thing to do. And it doesn't seem to be have trickled down. You go to Asian culture, and when I was a kid, in like 10 years old, I would go to Korea, and my 10-year-old cousin, he was gone all day doing school. So it's not as if this wisdom seems to have trickled down into Asian culture. And I've noticed in Western culture, at least where I live, this has gotten worse and worse and worse, is this insistence on sort of pushing kids academically very early. Well, Chinese medicine would say this is the improper time to be doing this, and that you're sort of suppressing fire, repressing fire. And so I often think about it as like sort of like a very successful engineer who is just a social failure. A very successful, like a mathematician, or just anyone who's really academically sharp, but just sort of, emotionally stunted, has trouble meeting people, has trouble maintaining friends and making friends and keeping all this stuff. That's sort of what I sort of think about with sometimes with like sort of suppression of the fire phase, But it could go the other way. The kid has too much craziness in that time, and some kind of trauma occurs at that time, and they never, in a sense, make that transition to earth. In a sense, I mean, how many people do you know that sort of never seem to have grown up, but not in a way that's cute, in a way that seems unhealthy? So this is Chinese medicine's notion about this. This is all of these. This is the 5 elements and how they relate to childhood development, how we should relate to children, and most specifically, how to understand pathology after the fact, in a sense. How to prevent pathology during, how to understand pathology later. So if you're speaking to your adult patients and you're digging a little bit deeper in the psychoanalysis realm, this can shed some light on where they might be stuck based on where you've been seeing traumas in their childhood in the first 7 to 8 years. Okay, good? All right, you guys, take it easy, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Hello, I'm here during the lunch rush with Janice, who owns her own food truck.
Best cheesesteaks in town.
Janice traded up to Geico Commercial Auto Insurance for her food truck business. We're here where she needs us most.
They sure are.
We make it so easy for her to save, with customised coverage that grows with her business. Sorry, I just get so emotional talking about saving folks money.
Not this onion I'm chopping?
It's just so beautiful. Oh yeah, no, it's the onion.
Get a commercial auto insurance quote today at geico.com and see how much you could save. Get more with Geico.
Your kids could get free or low-cost health coverage from Medicaid or CHIP. Even if you've applied before, they may be eligible now. Kids up to age 19 are covered for checkups, vaccines, dentist visits, hospital care, and more. And if they already have Medicaid or CHIP, remember to renew every year. Visit insurekidsnow.gov or call 877-KIDS-NOW. Paid for by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services.